Hope everyone's feeling good, ready to hand in the assignment tomorrow. Awesome. Yeah, I'm doing all right, thank you. Not too bad. Um, cool. Yeah, so I thought this evening I would start off by just seeing if there are any questions, last minute questions about the assignment. And I can obviously address anything like that. Otherwise, yeah, we're going to just chat a bit about research planning and designs, more so on the designs aspect of this, because yeah, it's a little bit content heavy, I suppose, and just we're going to unpack the different designs quantitatively so that they make sense. But yeah, are there any questions about the assignments? Anything that's still, anyone wants to clear up? Yeah, the word count is a bit hectic. Yeah, unfortunately, it's just, I guess, part of the assignments is just trying to do that conciseness practice. Every word must count, basically. Okay, no questions then. All right. Okie dokie. All right. So at this point, obviously, we should be fairly, you guys have come through INRS, touched on this through REPR, those of you who are doing it this semester as well. And yeah, so the qualitative and quantitative research process does follow these steps. Yeah, this is that slide that I was speaking about previously. Here it is. Yeah, this is that. Basically, the most important thing when it comes to understanding the process of research, again, just to reiterate, is that it does follow this systematic process, right? Obviously, starting with the research problem and then working your way all the way through to analysis and then obviously disseminating the results. Because if you don't share the results, really, there's no point in research. The whole point is to generate knowledge and then share that with the world to hopefully make some kind of difference. Yeah, so again, also, I think this is a question in your assignment anyway, isn't it? The process, yeah. So they are pretty much the same, whether quantitative or qualitative. It's just really the details or the types of the methods that you choose that differ between the two. Okay, does anyone have any questions about this though? Yeah, we can address that. Luca, your question about the assignment. Yes, okay, so yeah, it is a lot, and you can absolutely number the ethical considerations. That's cool. It makes it easier also to mark. Yeah, it's not an essay question, so you can absolutely do that. Okay, so yeah, the last question, the question 2.2 and 2.3 do differ in really in terms of practicality. So question 2.2 asks you about the considerations, and that's really theoretically, what considerations do people have to take into account, or what would you have to take into account in that scenario? And then question 3 is really asking you about the responsibilities you would face as a researcher in order to actually carry out those, make sure that you uphold those principles through your considerations. Yeah. So practically, what would you do to ensure informed consent, for instance? If you chose mixed methods, yes, because yeah, look, the mixed methods even as well also follows the same process. It's just that some of the steps are repeated, right? Because you would obviously still you'd establish the same problem, lit review, and then yeah, the design. So that would encompass both quantitative and qualitative aspects, and then basically the from steps 4, 5, 6, 7, and 8 will each have two parts to them. You'd have the qualitative data collection and then the quantitative data collection and so on for each section. So yeah, absolutely. As long as you do make that distinction clear that there would be two parts, and don't forget one of the parts at one of the stages. Okay, so you don't need to apply every single consideration in 2.3 because remember, practically you could do one thing that addresses more than one consideration as well. So you just, because it's out of 10 marks, as long as you're addressing 5 in the way of through responsibilities, you'll get the marks for that. Yeah, particularly because of the word count as well, right? Yeah. Okay. All right. So that's the research process and obviously the planning. And that's very much the first thing you have to do is try and look at it on a timeline and see each phase that you would be going through. And then when you get to the design part of it, which is about a third of the way through your planning, then you really need to ask yourself questions in terms of what exactly am I going to achieve? And so how am I going to do that? Okay, so there are different designs for qualitative, for quantitative, or mixed methods designs. Mixed methods, I mean, really is just kind of a piecing together of different aspects. And what you piece together in different ways depends on just the way that you want to construct that design and what makes sense. Okay, but yeah, so basically what will help you choose a relevant design will be overall your research objectives and obviously your approach, because as we will see now, there are many different types of quantitative designs that are all focused around the idea of experiment, and qualitative research doesn't do experiments, right? It's different. It's more focusing on experiences and exploring concepts. There's no empirical testing in that way. Okay. Yeah, and then also whether you rely on primary research or data or secondary data. Does anyone know the difference or remember the difference in secondary data? Anybody maybe? Let's see. Yeah, Kirsten, definitely on the right track. Yeah, so primary data would be data that you collect yourself as the researcher actively. So interviews, interview transcripts, focus group transcripts, survey data that you collect, right? And then secondary research is data that you could get from other sources that you didn't go and find yourself. And this often would happen when you are doing a desktop type design of a research, right? So let's say I'm doing a research article and I want to find out, I don't know, find out some patterns across the way that people seek healthcare for TB. I don't know. And so then I decide that I don't need to talk to people necessarily to get a quantitative overlook of that, or even qualitatively. I could access records from different clinics and things to look at things like that. And so that would be secondary data. Okay. Essentially, it's data that was collected for a different purpose that you can then use. Yeah, so exactly, yeah. So like statistical reports released by governments, by institutions, whatever, that is secondary data. Yeah, to you as an external person, to the people who got that data. Secondary is also if you're doing a study that is the design is a literature review, so it's called a systematic literature review, then the literature is that data. The text you analyze is also that is secondary level data. Yeah, so basically the thing to remember is that if you personally, the researcher, collected the data, it is then primary research, primary data, and if not, then it's secondary. Right. Okay, so these three things are really important, again, that will help you make the decision of what design you would choose for a project. First of all, obviously the research focus. So what is your research focusing on? You know, what actions are you taking to get your data? Are you observing something, or are you looking at reported data that already exists? Okay, so there's that primary, secondary data difference already. And yeah, so what are you looking at? Are you looking at current states of something? So maybe people's current state of health, mental health, or are you looking at more qualitative aspects, other things like attitudes, beliefs, lifestyles, things that are orientations that aren't necessarily something that can be measured effectively. It's more something that you could access in a different way. Okay, unit of analysis, that literally means just the thing that you're getting the data from. So this can be different things. You know, most likely you're dealing with individuals or groups of people, sometimes organizations. You know, industrial psychologists, for instance, do a lot of organizational research on and at the level of the organization. So a lot of the time, industrial psychologists will be hired by, let's say, like a big corporation to assess their productivity of their staff in a particular division. And because the focus of the analysis isn't necessarily on individual performance or it would be on the factors that affect that. So the environment, or in other words, the organizational factors. And then so that's why that unit of analysis would be the institution or the organization as opposed to just individuals within it. Period of time can be a unit of analysis. You can imagine how obviously historians would use that a lot. Time is the thing they're analyzing. But that can also come into it as almost a secondary unit of analysis if you are doing a longitudinal design. So this time dimension would be the last kind of thing that you think about, and that really makes quite a step in your decision tree possible. So let me also just see, does anyone know what longitudinal and cross-sectional mean? Does anyone remember? So if I say I'm doing a cross-sectional design, what does that mean in terms of time and data collection? One time frame? Yep. Cross-sectional may mean that it's two topics that correlate. Okay, not quite. Okay, so yeah, so it's about the time dimension specifically when we're talking about this terminology. So a longitudinal design happens over a period of time, right? An extended period of time. Yes. Okay. So there are a lot of studies, particularly psychologically, that have done very long longitudinal studies for development, right? For observing development over time. And they start studying children in different circumstances when they're 5 and then follow through for 20 years to see where they end up and what they look like for at 25. Yeah, a lot of twin studies, they do that kind of thing as well. So that would be a longitudinal design. You are collecting data at multiple points over a specified period of time. Cross-sectional research is like a one-shot snapshot. So you collect data once. So this would be like a once-off survey. If I wanted to, you know, get people's opinions on something, I send it out, I do it once, I write up my analysis, finished. That's a cross-sectional design. So it comes down to the amount of time it takes really and how many measurements you're doing. Okay. Yeah. But essentially any time that you need time to elapse before you make another observation or collect more data, that makes it a longitudinal design. If you're only collecting data once, that's a cross-sectional design. Right. Okay, so yeah, these, as we go through the levels of designs now, these concepts are going to come out. Okay, so just try bear this in mind. Okay, so your textbook does lay this out really nicely, actually, all of the types of research designs. But it would take quite a long time to go in depth into all of them. So I'm just going to highlight the important parts and what distinguishes the different types of designs. Okay, so you'll see first and foremost, the names are different and they will signal something pretty important. So we have pre-experimental designs, we have quasi-experimental designs, and we have pure experimental or just experimental designs. And so if we cast our minds back to what different types of research are, this is basically what defines these categories. So pre-experimental designs, meaning they don't quite fit the criteria to be called an experiment. So yeah, you can imagine that qualitative research will fall squarely in this category, okay? Because it is exploratory, it is all cross-sectional. You take like one thing, and generally time is not an issue. If you are taking 2 measurements, it would just be some kind of event, okay? And yeah, descriptive research. Quasi-experimental designs, very often if you have a correlation, it will be this kind of design. And then experimental is up for explanatory relationships. Experimental designs are used in quantitative research when you are trying to establish a causal relationship between 2 variables. Okay, and basically the different types of designs just fit different purposes for the study. Okay, so yeah, let's just go through a couple of these types of designs. Okay, so also these all kind of fit on a sliding scale from the least amount of scientific rigor to the most, okay? And so pre-experimental designs are considered the least rigorous design because there are multiple weaknesses that do appear in them, okay? And obviously we know that this idea of rigor and validity and reliability really impacts quantitative research far more significantly than qualitative research because of the purpose of the research, okay? But yeah, pre-experimental designs, also sometimes called non-designs because they are just very simple and do not focus on that experimental aspect. Okay. Yeah, very often qualitative, and there are a number of weaknesses that we'll discuss in a second. Okay. I put a little key here just to understand these diagrams. I often find the diagrams a little bit easier to explain with in terms, how the case studies work. So with these little drawings, or I don't know, schematics, I guess, that you'll see throughout the slideshow, the X means some kind of incident or intervention, something that you do to see what the effect of it is, okay? Yeah. So we'll brainstorm some examples as we go along. Okay, so a one-shot case study. So one shot also gives you an idea as to that it is obviously cross-sectional because you're measuring once and time is not a factor. Okay, so wherever you see O, it means observation or measurement, or yeah, that is the collection of data. Okay, so with these ones also, there's only one group, okay, one group of participants for the entire study, the entire design, and that is what you're looking at. So that in itself introduces a weakness, okay, so there's only one group. Why do you guys think that could be a weakness in a design, particularly thinking along the lines of quantitative research? Only looking at one group. Yes, much more difficult to generalize the results, of course. Also, think along the lines of comparison. Anyone? Yeah, like, look, in terms of the amount of data, possibly, because it's one group, but it doesn't mean that there's a small amount of people in the group. So what I'm getting at, it's more that you can do this experiment and you can observe this data, even if you observe 1,000 people. If you don't have another situation to compare it to, it would be difficult to prove scientifically that X, whatever X may be, actually had an effect on your group. Okay. All right. So yeah, that means that these designs really are not suited to quantitative research much at all, because of these kinds of weaknesses where you are trying to either find some kind of comparison to establish a relationship. Okay. So yeah, these are basically just different forms of these one group designs. So you have a one-shot case study. So basically, I mean, you could even leave the X out of this and it's just simply O, right? Because especially for qualitative research, this is what qualitative research is like. You'd go out, you'd interview some people, and that's what you analyze. You just have one observation. That's what you're doing, right? You're not manipulating anything in any way. On the other hand, you can do something where you take more than one measurement, okay, or you collect data more than once with some kind of intervention in the middle. Yeah, so you do get qualitative designs that do follow this method, especially along the lines of community psychology in particular, when they design interventions to try and solve a problem. So let's say someone's designing an intervention program to try to reduce bullying at a school. Let's say that the program includes, I don't know, however many lessons on the, I don't know, bad effects of bullying and consequences thereof over the term. And then, people can maybe interview the kids before that, and then at the end of the term, take another measurement. Well, make another observation, collect more data. And then you can do that comparison between the first before and then the after. Yes, very similar to what would happen in your assignments if you are following that kind of intervention thinking, absolutely, qualitatively. And yeah, it's really perfectly valid for qualitative research. It's just what happens. You don't need that control group, which will enter now in the next category, because it's not about comparing to the population, it's about understanding that contextual significance. Okay, intact group comparison design. So this is similarly to the idea of a control group, but only with one measurement. So obviously then less generalizable in terms of quantitative research. So you'd make an observation after an event, some kind of intervention, and you could compare that to another observation that was made without that intervention taking place on the same group though. And then you can make that comparison. But again, if you think along the lines of quantitatively and validity and reliability, that comparing it to a control when there's only one group, that really doesn't help in terms of validity and generalizing, because any amount of confounding variables, which we'll get to in a second, could have acted on that measurement. What are confounding variables, you may be asking yourselves? Okay, so if something confounds something, basically it means it introduces an unknown element that can have an effect on something that wasn't intended. Okay, some kind of unintended consequence that can happen in these one group pre-test, post-test, or just post-test designs. And yeah, these are just some examples of confounding variables. Okay, yeah, and so you think, so if we take an example, when we make an observation, we do a bullying workshop, we make another observation to see what happened. You can see how some of these things may come into play and have an effect on that measurement, which would obscure your understanding of how useful that intervention was. Okay. All right, so attrition is a big thing in all research, actually. So just start here. Basically, dropouts of participants. So quantitatively, this can be a problem, because you could have, let's say, 500 people taking part in the first time, and then doing the intervention or not doing the intervention, and then so you don't have that corresponding data afterwards. And then, yeah, if you've got a lot of attrition in a sample, it drastically affects your data. Okay. Yeah, history. Okay, so if we think of history in terms of something may have happened in the past that you don't know about to influence the data you collect. So let's think about this qualitatively, right? Because this can obviously be a problem in qualitative research. Could anyone possibly think of a scenario where this may be an issue? If you're investigating or exploring something and you're interviewing someone, how do you think that history may play a role there? Yeah, you're all pretty much on the right track. So yeah, firstly, absolutely biased, right? So when you when you interview someone, you don't really know their personal beliefs and values and personal history, and that or anything that could have been literally past events that may take place in their lives that could influence their experience of what you are trying to explore. And yeah, it's something that you could literally have absolutely no knowledge of, and it could completely obscure your thing, what you're trying to find, your data. Yeah, absolutely. So this is something we have to guard against at a postgraduate level quite often, even from the perspective of the researcher, because, and this actually comes into ethics as well. But yeah, a lot of the time, you design this really interesting, super interesting study, and you go like, yes, I'm going to go interview 8 Gen Z mothers on what it's like parenting in their generation, whatever. I don't know. Okay, something random makes sense. That's the design. It seems perfect. And the focus there is on, generational differences. How does that affect parenting or influence parenting decisions? Something like that. But any number of events in that person's life previously could have an effect on their parenting style that's not necessarily attributed to just simply them being a part of that generation. Okay. So yeah, that's just an example of how this does play a role and how you need to be aware of that and kind of like make plans to supersede it if possible. But yeah, quantitatively, by introducing a control group, you eliminate a lot of these problems. Okay, so maturation is also another problem that can happen. That just the simple phenomenon that things do change over time. So this is a confounding variable if in very longitudinal studies. I'm sure you can imagine that, yeah, like socioeconomic situations change over time, and that could affect development in a way that you would have had absolutely no idea that would happen. And I mean, that has happened. If you think about just the depressions and things that we've been through economically, and even the current situation, like people that started these kinds of studies in the 90s on children then could have never foreseen COVID happening, for example, and the massive effect that that had on all sorts of spheres of development. So enter confounding variable that you need to try and account for. And more likely just to take into account with qualitative research, just to bear in mind on how that may impact the context. Well, that's interesting, Petra. Yeah, look, I mean, this whole thing of parenting can go online. But yeah, often actually, I mean, that's a better situation than continuing the cycle of abuse in a way. So, I mean, yeah, interesting. Okay, what else do we have here? Instrumentation. Okay, this is an interesting one. So especially, and this is why, particularly in qualitative research with semi-structured interviews, it is really important that you do stick to that kind of schedule and ask the same questions of your participants. Because obviously, if your questions are different, then you're going to get different answers. And yeah, if your instruments, so instruments in this case, meaning your questionnaire or survey or list of interview questions, if that changes, then that can have obviously a bad effect on your variable at any stage. that happens. And this also what this random, but when Carl did it, it was different. Yeah, like this comes down to the idea of interview bias in qualitative research, interviewer bias. So as an interviewer, this is also a difficult skill that you start to think about when you do actually start doing your own research, is that if you're in a bad mood when you conduct an interview one day, and then the next day you're extremely happy and peppy and conversational, you can imagine how that is absolutely going to affect your data. Because in that instance of an interview, it's a conversation. You need to be evoking this response from the participants. And if you're just not feeling it, then well, neither will they, and your data is going to be affected by that. Yeah, these are all just examples. Okay, what else? Okay, test effect is another big one just to highlight, is that, yeah, participants get bored, right? This happens a lot with the test effect is huge in psychological assessment, especially with children. So any of those like learning, cognition tests, IQ tests, even any of those assessments that educational psychologists or psychometrists do with children, they always have to account for that test effect. The fact that when they test a child once, the next time they do it, they're bored because they've done it before, or just they get bored because it's a 3-hour test and they're 12 and that's a long time. So yeah, test effects, something you need to take into account. And this also can apply to qualitative methodology, because same thing, right? If you have like make this like 3-hour long interview, by the time you get to the end of it, your participant is very likely going to be emotionally tired or bored, and it will affect their engagement. So yeah, it all comes down to maximizing the potential that you have to get around things like this. Righty. Sorry, does anyone have any questions about confounding variables? You know, these are just some of the most common ones. There are so many, and it completely depends on the context. That's such a great example, Kirsten. Actually, I must remember that one. Yeah, there's the story of a horse that learned like basic mathematics, and obviously the owner was convinced that that's what was happening. But in actuality, it just stamped its leg to show an answer because it was waiting for its owner to smile. Yeah, so in that way, it's also that also, yes, the researcher was like waiting for something else to happen, which skewed the results, but also it shows you that the participants has their own perception on what's going on as well, and in that way it can confound what's going on as well. And yeah, again, like this is something we've just been addressing a lot with our honor students, is making interview questions accessible to your participants, right? You can't assume that the person you're speaking to has an intimate knowledge of the psychological theory that you're dealing with. You have to make it so that you're on the same page when you're talking about what you're talking about. Alrighty. Cool. Okay, moving on to quasi-experimental designs. Okay, so these are really all about comparison, and the most salient one is the contrasted group design. So starting at this phase, you have more than one group, and that's what is important about this type of design, right? That's why it's all about the comparison. So the idea here is that you'd be looking for a difference, essentially. And so that also would then, like the purpose of your research would determine why you would choose a design like this. If your research question is asking if there is a difference in academic performance between, I don't know, 19-year-olds or 18-year-olds in a matric class, you're looking for that difference. That is what you're looking for, okay? That's your measurement. As opposed to doing a correlation when you're looking for a relationship between two things, okay? So you can see how already designs and purpose are having an effect on each other. Okay, contrasted group design. So remember the word contrasted literally just means compared, really, in this instance. So that is this idea of comparing groups together, okay, and even possibly comparing different test results at different times. I know this thing is a bit confuzzling, but the longer you look at it, the more it makes sense. So if you have group A and group B, you do that comparison, you find some kind of difference. Hooray for you, you found a difference, right? And then, yeah, you do a comparison on the results, that's the difference, and then you compare that, and that's your final thing, right? So you look at the difference that there is between your groups, like what makes your groups different, what is the contrast there, what makes them differ, and then what is that comparative difference in the results. And that is the purpose of this design, really, okay, that ultimate comparison. And it's great because it lets you determine, yeah, some kind of level of difference, which on its own is not necessarily the most rigorous conclusion to a study, right? But can be very useful in terms of paving the way for further research and further testing. Yeah, so a way to increase the rigor of a design like this would be to introduce a control group. Okay, and as soon as a control group enters the mix, we have arrived at the experimental design category. Sorry, I will go back to that just because I'm like on a roll now. Okay, so whenever we bring a control group into the equation, it means that we have something solid to compare against to see if our intervention actually had an effect on our group, and that it wasn't just chance that the results changed. Okay, because we can assume that the control group would, in other words, not go through any kind of intervention, right? And they get measured before, they get measured later, and yeah, do not experience intervention. Okay, the treatment group, or just the active group, or the measurement group, really this is referred to in different ways, but basically just not the control group, often just the experimental group, okay? They get measured before at the same time, then they do experience this kind of intervention. This is the design we use for clinical trials of medications. It's the design that you use for different therapeutic interventions if they're trying to test that quantitatively. Yes, so in this, for that example, the treatment group would receive the drugs and the control group would not, right? And then you can, in that way, you're making different levels of comparisons. You are looking at the data from the before in this group and the after in that group and seeing differences there. You also must compare the differences from before and after in the control group, and I mean, hope that nothing changed, because otherwise that's confusing and you'd have to run it again to see why something changed. Because in theory it shouldn't, right? Because of just the theory of continuity, that if nothing changes, nothing will change in the thing that you're trying to measure. So then you end up doing this kind of downward comparison as well at each point in time. And ultimately, this is how we would establish a causal relationship, that A affects B, right, in quantitative research. And very importantly would come in this aspect of randomization, and that is for generalization, right? But yeah, just more importantly, in terms of just thinking about designs, what makes something an experimental group is that there are more than one group, and one of them is a control group. Okay. Essential. Control groups do not go through the intervention, or they do not receive the treatment. Okay. In other words, like there's no X here. Okay, let me just go back now because I didn't mean to skip these ones. So a cohort design are basically, it's the same understanding as a one-shot case study or a group pre-test, post-test design. But the point is that you are testing some kind of effect on a cohort. So that a cohort means it's a group of people that share some kind of characteristic. So you guys are all a cohort of Varsity College third year online students, right? That's your cohort. That's the characteristic you share. And if I wanted to see or compare different cohorts, like if I wanted to compare your guys' final exam results with the cohort from 10 years ago, that would make that a cohort design. Okay. So you can have different types of cohort designs, really, is the point of this one. Yeah, and very ideal for things like longitudinal studies when you want to see what changes over time. Okay, again, on the idea of time and time making differences, all longitudinal studies follow a time series design, and then they may also have this element, obviously, of pre-test, post-test, or yeah, they may also just be post-test only kind of thing where there just isn't an event in the middle. Okay, so yeah, time series, more importantly though, is that there are multiple measurements on either side of the event or the intervention. Okay, sure, Kurt. Yeah, so that's what's important because basically it allows for this comparison between multiple pre-tests so you can establish some kind of a pattern. Then the event happens and then you compare that to multiple measurements after the event. Okay, so in this way you can see how time, the effect of time on something can be measured, right? Let's say perhaps we are looking at an intervention for PTSD. So that would be the event. It would be, let's say it's a peer support program that's been developed to help patients who are suffering from PTSD for whatever reason. Okay. So then let's say we collect some data for 3 months before they do the intervention. Each month you take a measurement of whatever kind of scale you're using in this case to measure something. Okay, and you have those results to see maybe also then you could get an idea of where if their PTSD is progressing over time, is it remaining stable, that kind of stuff. And then the event happens, right? We have the group program, it starts to take effect. Okay. So then immediately after that, you take a measurement to see if something has changed. You compare the last measurement you took to this latest one, and you could get kind of a preliminary result on that. But you then continue over time, let's say for the next 3 months, taking that same measurement again. And you would get a clearer idea by comparing those measurements to see if maybe it's more effective or less effective over time. So you can imagine how very much in psychology this is often very useful, especially with things like trying to see if a particular intervention or a particular mode of therapy or obviously psychological drugs work over time, or if they have kind of a phenomenal effect once and then it wanes. That's really important for understanding how to intervene in psychological problems. Okay. So yeah, time series design really just with the explicit purpose to see if that change over time is significant on either side of an event. Okay. So you could also manipulate this, and you'll see again the more you go and you study the different types of designs that you can manipulate almost all of them to suit your purpose. Let's say I just don't want to take that pre-test measurement. I don't have time. I want to intervene immediately with a group of veterans that I've come across, and I want to see what happens. I send them all to therapy, and yeah, we see what happens, right? There was no time to take that pre-test measurement. So that does sacrifice a little bit of that validity, right? A little bit of that rigor because we don't have a pre-test measurement to compare to, but could still be significant because I just want to simply see how the treatment effect lasts over time. And then that pre-measurement isn't necessarily significant in the design of that research. Okay, so yeah, look, I know this is a bit of an information overload, but yeah, what I'm trying to just convey is really that it all comes down to the purpose of your research, what the problem, what you're trying to solve, and exactly what variables you think will account for that. And then you design your study in a way that will actually test that for you, okay, or help you explore that using qualitative language. Okay, that's the last one. No, there's still factorial, but it's fine. Are there any questions on anything we've done up until this moment in time? Up until the big experimental design, so the pre-test, post-test, control group design? Yeah, so you'll find that this one, it's a mouthful, but that's literally what it's called. It's a pre-test, post-test control group design because it has all of those elements in it. Can also then be adapted for whatever reason. So you can imagine how you could then turn this into a time series design, just simply by taking multiple measurements before and multiple measurements after, and also with the control group, and yeah, having all of those, that abundant amount of data to compare. Let me just see what's on this slide. Okay, so yeah, we've been dealing a lot of the time with this idea of having a pre-measurement and then a post-measurement to compare. But a lot of the time, and particularly in psychological research, like I said now with the PTSD thing, that pre-test doesn't always happen. And the way that you would adjust to keep the rigor of that design is by having a control group. Because although you don't have something to compare before the intervention took place, you have something that didn't go through it to compare it to, right? And yeah, you test a hypothesis through this with the understanding that the control group should not change over time significantly. Whereas hopefully, if your intervention does have a desired effect, that will change over time. Okay. Cool. I will bring up this kind of thing again when we start data analysis, when we get into the stats, because I think just relating that to actual research designs and examples makes it far more accessible. Okay, so the last experimental design is the most rigorous and the most complex. But yeah, you don't need to know like the really intricate details of a design like this. More so just that when you have more than one independent variable, you have to use a design like this that accounts for each variable, okay? And these are called factorial designs. And these are used when you're looking for a causal relationship, okay? So the example here given with caffeine is like, I think, the most relatable thing ever. So if those of you who rely on caffeine to function, as me. So this is an example of having two independent variables. Well, actually one independent variable, two independent variables, and each variable has different levels, okay? And this is really the important thing there. So there's two things happening that to complicate the design, really. You've got more than one independent variable, so more than one thing you're measuring, and then those each have multiple levels. So for instance, in this example, our variable of caffeine has two levels, either maybe some caffeine or none at all. And then the time of day being the other variable, either morning or afternoon. So let me paint a picture to make this make some sense contextually. Let's say that I have noticed that students coming into my class carrying a coffee cup are somewhat more awake during the lesson. Okay, and I want to design the most rigorous experiment I can think of to see if this is in fact true, if caffeine has some sort of cognitive magic that makes them concentrate for longer. Okay, so that's two variables that I can put into this measurement. So I want to know independently if caffeine has an effect on attention span, and also if the time of day that the caffeine is consumed has an effect on concentration and what that effect may be. Okay. So yeah, this is really just this design is used when you have this complexity in these measurements. And yeah, basically it really comes down to, again, the purpose, right? And just to complicate it a bit more, to get more of an in-depth understanding. And also you're now accounting for another variable that may very well make a difference in your experiment. So yeah, and then you'd end up with 4 measurements, essentially, that you would then combine in a complicated statistical measure called an ANOVA, but you absolutely do not need to worry about that until postgrad. Okay. Yeah, you see, Kirsten, excellent. You're thinking ahead. That could be absolutely be a confounding variable, right? Like if I take my students and be like, no, excuse me, you are not allowed to have caffeine until 1 o'clock just before our lesson, that could absolutely have an effect on the symptoms, especially because caffeine is something that is absolutely like a dependency substance. So you kind of crave it, right? You need it when you need it. It's like nicotine or sugar or anything else. So yeah, if you then inadvertently mess with someone's system that already exists, that will affect your data and skew it. Right, and that's designs, guys. Yeah, overload of info, I know, but really the more that you just read through it and think about it and try and come up with your own examples to make them make sense, and then that helps quite significantly with understanding research designs. But ultimately, the golden rule is that the design must fit the purpose of the research. Okay. For instance, like if I am doing a qualitative study and I want to know how students experience that buzz feeling of after their morning cup of coffee, this kind of design would be useless. It just wouldn't contribute to what I'm looking at. Okay. Yeah, it's just really important to continually ask yourself, what is the purpose? What am I trying to find out? And that should narrow down the choice of design. And yeah, obviously just that level of experiment. So this design obviously would just never really come into a play at all for qualitative research because it's an experiment. Cool. Long spiel. Good spiel. Are there any questions about anything? This is also the last chance for any last second panic questions about the assignments, any of this content, anything at all. The floor is yours. I saw a question pop up earlier about REPR. Let me just scroll up so I can address that now. I didn't want to break the flow. Okay, so for project 3 of REPR, do we need to identify and discuss a chosen design for our study? Project 3, yes, you do. That is the first part of project 3. It's paradigm and design. So yeah, if you're doing quantitative research, is it cross-sectional or is it longitudinal? And quantitatively, what design makes sense, okay? Qualitatively, it's usually literally just sufficient to say it's a cross-sectional design. If you're just doing one set of observations, you're collecting data once, that is your design, really, qualitatively. And then, yeah, more information about the design is informed by the paradigm that you choose. And you explain it in that way. It's more practical than technical, okay? Yeah, so the main thing we'll be looking for that when you have to identify a design qualitatively is a cross-sectional or longitudinal. And then that's vital to explain. And I mean, that applies to the subject as well, obviously, if you are asked that in the exam or something, it's possible. Are these slides up for us? They are not currently. I will embed them when I add the recording to Learn so that you can make notes from them. Okay. Feel as though you're brain dead. Same. I get you. No, it's fine. And yeah, I think this assignment is actually quite draining in that sense. It's a lot of regurgitation of information. So I get you guys. I understand. Okay, someone from the group chat wants a clarification of question 1.2. She said that she won't be able to make it. Okay. There must be 3 mentioned. Okay, does anyone have question 1.2 on them? I can't recall it immediately. Oh, Shay Amelia, thank you for the compliment. But it'll be okay. Don't worry. You're going to be confident when we reach the end of this subject anyway. Okay, well, someone finds question 1.2 for me because I absolutely can't remember it. There we go. Wishes to develop a theory that will inform the interventions. Oh, yes. Okay. So briefly discuss the process of theory development. Okay, so there are 3 processes that are involved in theory development, and it's in that chapter in the textbook. So yes, you should discuss all 3 in terms of the scenario to get full marks for that. Okay. Thanks, guys, for supplying the question. It would have literally taken me longer to go and try and open the document. Okay, cool. If there aren't any other questions, thank you all for attending and for engaging. And I hope you have a fabulous evening and the rest of the week and things, and I will see you next time. And good luck with those final touches and submitting the assignment. Please don't leave it till last minute.